Somewhere on a shelf in a garage in Sanford, North Carolina, there are 3 trophies, a Rumpel furniture cap, and a photograph of a man in tennis shoes standing next to a race car that probably should have been retired years before he climbed into it. And the reason that photograph matters, the reason we are sitting here talking about a guy most people under 40 have never heard of, is because that man in the photograph died on a racetrack in upstate New York on a Sunday morning in August of 1991, and the single most important piece of evidence in understanding why he died just disappeared. Gone. Vanished from NASCAR custody and never returned to his widow. If you think that story ends with a crash report and a closed casket, you are about to find out how wrong that assumption is. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the privateer era of NASCAR and the men who got left behind when the corporate money arrived. If you're someone who loves the deep, complicated, uncomfortable history of stock car racing, the stuff that never makes the highlight reels, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about NASCAR. By the summer of 1991, the sport had been through a complete identity transformation in about a decade, and it had happened so fast that 2 completely different worlds were sharing the same garage. On one side, you had Rick Hendrick running multi-car operations funded by dealership money. You had Junior Johnson with Budweiser on the hood. You had Richard Childress with Good Wrench and Dale Earnhardt. You had Roger Penske already setting up shop. The Greensboro News and Record put a number in print the morning after our man died, and that number was $1 million a season per car, and every single person in that garage knew it was true. Television rights were being negotiated. Sponsors were paying for full body wraps that cost more than some teams' entire annual operating budget. Tracks were repaving and reconfiguring. The corporate sport had arrived, it was hungry, and it was very actively trying to leave the chicken wire days behind. And then there was JD McDuffie. Sanford, North Carolina. A shop he had built himself. A 1970 Chevrolet Ramp truck. He drove himself to the racetrack. 3 race cars on the property, all of them with somebody else's old fingerprints all over them. A pit crew of guys who had day jobs and were not getting paid to be there. A sponsor list that read like the yellow pages of small-town Carolina. Rumpel Furniture out of Elon. Sons Auto Supply. Bailey Excavating. Classic Trophies. Hometown businesses paying hometown money so a hometown guy could keep going to the racetrack. His average per race payday in 1991 was about $2,000. His total career Winston Cup earnings across 28 years and 653 starts came to $1,338,000. That is less than what a top driver was making in a single weekend by then. JD McDuffie was the last man standing of an era the sport was actively trying to forget. So who exactly is this guy, and why does his story matter enough to spend serious time on it in 2024? John Delphus McDuffie Jr. was born December 5, 1938, in Upper Little River Township in Harnett County, North Carolina. His daddy was John Delphus Sr. His mama was Ruby Lee Dean McDuffie. He had a brother named Glenn. He was 10 years old when somebody took him to Bowman Gray Stadium for the first time, and that was effectively the end of him doing anything else with his life. He grew up idolizing Curtis Turner and Glenn Wood and Billy Myers. He started running short tracks in his teens. He won a track championship at a little dirt track near Rockingham in the early 60s. By July 7, 1963, he was making his NASCAR Grand National debut at Ramby Raceway in Myrtle Beach, driving Curtis Turner's old 1961 Ford, which Curtis had outgrown. He qualified 14th and finished 12th out of 18 cars. There was another driver named Floyd Powell already using number 70 on the regional circuits, so JD's Ford ran with just a big painted letter X on the door for a while. As soon as he could, he claimed 70 back. He picked 70, he said, because it was easy to paint and easy to remember. In 1959, he had married a woman named Imogene Wood, and they would have 2 kids together. A son named Jeffrey Wayne, born in '62, who would eventually serve as his daddy's crew chief and even make 5 Winston Cup starts of his own, and a daughter named Linda Karen. The whole life was built out of Sanford. The shop, the hauler, the family, the identity. It all came from one zip code in the middle of North Carolina. Now, JD was never going to be confused with Petty or Pearson or Yarborough. He didn't have the raw talent of those guys, and he never pretended he did. But he had something else. He had what Marty Burke, who ran his crew for years, called the quality of being a man of his word. He chewed Tampa Nugget cigars in the cockpit, usually with his open-faced helmet on. He wore grease-spotted tennis shoes in the garage, jeans, a Sun's Auto Supply shirt, a Rumple furniture cap. Greensboro columnist Ron Green called him a walking, talking, driving museum piece, and that was not an insult. That was an accurate physical description of a man who looked like he had walked out of a 1957 modified race and just never stopped walking. Here's what most people don't realize about JD McDuffie. He was not always a backmarker. The peak years came earlier than the casual fan remembers. In 1971, he finished 9th in Winston Cup points. That was the best year of his career. His best career finish came that same season, a 3rd place at Albany-Saratoga Speedway in Malta, New York, in a 100-miler. In 1973, he finished 10th in point. He had legitimate top 10 potential as a driver if he had ever been in the right car, which he never really was. Then in 1978, he bought a chassis from Richard Childress Racing in partnership with a man named Donald Mangum. And on September 17, 1978, at Dover Downs, he qualified that car on the pole for the Delaware 500. 135.48 miles per hour. He was the only car on McCreary tires while everybody else was on Goodyear, and he stuck it on the pole. He led the first 10 laps before Bobby Allison got around him, blew the engine on lap 80, finished 33rd. But for one Sunday afternoon at Dover, he had been the fastest driver in NASCAR's top division. That was his one pole. He never won a race. He never finished higher than 3rd. But for one weekend, he was officially the best of them. Because of that pole, he was invited to the inaugural Busch Clash at Daytona in 1979, a special race for pole winners only. He drove with Petty and Allison and Yarborough as an equal. It was the highest his public profile would ever be in the sport. And then the money problem just kept compounding itself year over year until it became insurmountable. By 1982, he was hitting his 500th career start at Bristol, and the sport was beginning to pass him by in ways that had nothing to do with his driving ability. He was still good company in the garage. He was still everybody's friend. Darrell Waltrip and Junior Johnson actually trusted him enough that at Riverside in November of '82, they put him in Junior's second car as a championship insurance policy, so that if Waltrip's primary car got wrecked in practice or qualifying, Waltrip would have somewhere to go without giving up his points. JD got a steering wheel that day because Junior Johnson and Darrell Waltrip thought he could be trusted not to wreck it. Think about what that tells you about exactly where he stood with the people who truly understood the sport from the inside. But the money problem just kept getting worse, and the corporate sport was leaving him behind faster than he could chase it. He was building his own engines because he could not afford to buy them. He was running parts that other teams considered worn out, and he would run them another season on top of that. Marty Burke put it plainly years later. He said JD never ran junk. The parts might have been used, but they were not wore out. He had to run conservatively to preserve his equipment because if you broke something, there was no replacement coming. There was no second engine in the trailer. There was no parts account at a supplier. There was just whatever was in the shop back in Sanford. In 1984, his son Jeff got in a car accident. JD received an insurance check from that accident. He took the insurance money from his own son's wreck and put every dollar of it into the race team to keep it running for another week or two. That is not my characterization of the situation. That is Ron Green of the Greensboro News and Record writing that detail in JD's obituary in August of 1991. The man poured his kid's accident money into a race car because the race car was the family business, and the family business was about to starve. In February 1988, he showed up to Daytona for the Twin 125 qualifying races and discovered that somebody had stolen his fireproof gloves directly out of the garage. There was no replacement set in the truck, so he drove the qualifier without gloves. He came out of that car with second and third degree burns across both hands. When he came back to the racetrack the following year, his hands were still visibly puffy and red in photograph, and he was racing again because there was no other option. If he didn't race, he didn't eat. That was a direct quote he gave to a reporter that same year. "Racing is my life. If I don't run, I don't eat. This ain't a weekend hobby to me." By the late 80s, he was missing more races than he was making. 7 starts in '89. 8 starts in 1990. The Hutcherson-Pagan Pontiacs he ran when he could pull together the budget were genuinely good cars, but his shop did not have the resources to repair them quickly when something happened. And things kept happening. So we get to February 1991 and Speed Weeks at Daytona, which is the single moment that tells you everything you need to know about JD McDuffie's standing in the garage and the brutal economics he was permanently working against. He showed up for Daytona with one engine. That was the entire budget. He went out for practice and the engine blew up. With no second engine in the trailer and no money to rent a replacement, JD made the call to start loading up all blue and drive back to Sanford, because there was nothing else to do. He had driven 500 miles to go home with nothing. And then the garage came to him. The story has been told a few different ways over the years, but the version that everybody agrees on is that Dale Earnhardt and Richard Childress walked through the garage with a literal hat in their hands and collected $6,600 in cash from competing teams. From people who were going to be racing against him that weekend. From the very corporate operations that were squeezing the privateers out of the sport year by year. They handed JD McDuffie the cash so he could rent an engine and make a Twin 125. He took that engine, made the field, and finished 21st in his qualifier. He didn't make the 500 itself, but he was on the racetrack for what he had come there to do. Now, you might be thinking that moment sounds like a heartwarming story about NASCAR community and sportsmanship, and it is that. But look at what it also reveals. The sport's biggest names had to pass a hat because the structural economics of the series had made it impossible for a man with 28 years of experience to show up to the most important race weekend of the year with enough money to handle a single mechanical failure in practice. The hat passing was not charity. It was the consequence of a system that had never bothered to address what happened to the men it was pricing out. The 1991 season got harder from there. The blue Hutcherson-Pagan Pontiac got wrecked at Talladega in May. Then the red Hutcherson-Pagan car got wrecked at Dover when Kenny Wallace, substituting for the injured Kyle Petty, spun JD into the inside wall. That left him with one car. The oldest one. The third car in the inventory. It was an ex-Richard Childress racing chassis, one of Dale Earnhardt's old Wrangler Chevrolets from earlier in the 80s. Childress had sold it in '86 to a man named Tom Winkle out of Defiance, Ohio. Winkle had it rebodied into a Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2 configuration. When Winkle backed out of his racing program later that same year, JD ended up with the car. He drove it for years. In March of '91, he actually sold the car to Marty Burke, his own crewman, so he would not have to carry it on the books anymore. But Marty kept it with the team, and Marty was the one who would prep it for races. That was the car going to Watkins Glen. The oldest one. The bottom of the inventory. The fallback option. This is where it gets really interesting because you have to understand what Watkins Glen was as a racetrack in August of 1991. Because what was about to happen at that circuit had already been telegraphed in plain sight, and nobody with the authority to act on it had acted. The course is 2.428 miles of road racing in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Beautiful country. Brutal layout. The fastest section is the back straight, which runs about 2,600 feet essentially flat out, at the end of which sits a corner called the Loop. Turn 5. An embanked right-hander that you arrive at carrying everything the car will give you, and that you have to scrub off enormous speed for in an extraordinarily short distance. There was no gravel trap on the outside of that corner. There was Armco steel guardrail backed by a stack of tires. In 1989, Jeff Bodine blew a tire entering the loop and hit that tire barrier head-on. He walked away. Then on June 30, 1991, 6 weeks before McDuffie's race, a man named Tommy Kendall came into Turn 5 in a Camel GT prototype, an Intrepid RM1. He had a wheel failure. He hit the same tire barrier in roughly the same location. He broke both of his legs and was effectively finished as a sports car prototype driver for the season. Kendall had originally been scheduled to substitute for Kyle Petty in the August Cup race. He was now in a hospital bed. The pattern was already fully established. Wheel failures and tire failures coming into the fastest corner on the course. A tire barrier with steel behind it. No meaningful runoff. The Glen knew about Turn 5. The Sanford team rolled into Watkins Glen on Thursday, August 8, 1991. 6 crew guys. Jeff McDuffie as crew chief. Marty Burke, Mike Demers, Jerry Glenn, Don Owens, Ed Peters, and a Canadian named George Secanina. All Blue had blown its brakes on the way up and JD had jammed a pop rivet into the brake line to plug the leak so they could keep driving north. That is how they arrived at the racetrack. With a pop rivet in the hauler brake line. That single detail tells you the whole story about the operation, because while every other team was rolling in with 18-wheelers and full tool trailers and backup parts accounts at suppliers, JD McDuffie was nursing a 21-year-old ramp truck up the interstate on hardware store improvisation and willpower. The car was the burgundy and black ex-Wrangler Pontiac with a white center stripe. Number 70. They had Bilstein rebuilt shocks, a transmission bought at auction from the defunct Blue Max racing team, and an engine that had been built by Jerry Glenn through a New Jersey speed shop called Medford Speed. They had picked up a one-race sponsorship deal with L.C. Whitford Company, a Wellsville, New York construction firm whose logos were going on the quarter panels. Marty Burke later said this was the most prepared they had ever been for a race weekend. They had real money for once. They had a real sponsor. They had the car cleaned up and ready to go. JD was in genuinely good spirits about the whole situation. Friday, August 9th, was the first qualifying round. Terry Labonte set a new track record in the Hagen Racing Oldsmobile at 1 minute 11.851 seconds, 121.652 miles per hour. JD did not lock in on Friday. Saturday, August 10th, was the second qualifying round. JD ran a 1:16 flat, which put him 35th on the grid for Sunday's race. His 6th consecutive Cup start at Watkins Glen. That same Saturday night, he had agreed to run a charity celebrity race at Shangri-La Speedway in Owego, New York. Earnhardt and Dale Jarrett were there as paid appearances. JD had gone over to sell fan club memberships and meet people. He ended up in a car owned by a guy named Tom Schwartz, and he absolutely cleaned up. Marty Burke described it later by saying JD was the class of the field. He pulled out into a lead and then deliberately tried to keep the rest of the field close so the fans would get a good show. He won the race. In Victory Lane, he told the crowd they had a real good time and that he hoped he could repeat it tomorrow. That was Saturday night, 18 hours before he died. Sunday, August 11th, 1991. Heavy overcast at Watkins Glen. Around 125,000 spectators on hand. 40-car field. ESPN was broadcasting with Bob Jenkins in the booth and Benny Parsons stationed at Turn 1 and Ned Jarrett positioned on the exit of Turn 5, about 75 feet from where the crash was going to happen. Jerry Punch and John Kernan were on pit road. JD ate breakfast that morning with the team. He paid the tab using the cash he had won the night before at Shangri-La. He went to the driver's meeting wearing his son's auto supply shirt, his jeans, his Rumpel furniture cap. Ernie Irvan made a joke at him coming out of the meeting. Ernie said, "JD, you smoked them last night, didn't you? You've been holding out on us all these years." JD laughed. The race went green. Lap 1. Lap 2. Lap 3. Lap 4. He was running in the back of the field where he always ran, just trying to survive, just trying to finish, just trying to bring it home and collect a payday. On lap 5, he came down the back straight at full throttle with the rest of the field. Heading into the loop. Heading into turn 5. The fastest part of the racetrack. And the left front wheel spindle on the number 70 Pontiac broke. What that means in plain English is that the piece of hardware connecting the wheel to the suspension structurally failed. When that happened, several things occurred simultaneously. The brakes failed instantly, because the brake on a stock car is attached to the wheel hub assembly. When the hub goes, the brake goes with it. The steering on that corner of the car became irrelevant, because the wheel was no longer attached to the suspension geometry. And the left front wheel and tire simply departed the car. Just rolled off at approximately 160 miles per hour. JD was now committed to the fastest corner on the racetrack with no brakes and no functional left front. There was nothing he could do. He clipped Jimmy Means's right front fender. Means was running just ahead of him in the number 52 Alka-Seltzer Pontiac. Both cars left the racetrack. Means's car had brakes from his side of the impact and was able to bleed off some speed. JD's car had nothing. It went across the grass at nearly full speed and hit the Armco-backed tire barrier passenger side first at an estimated speed of around 160 miles per hour. The car launched into the air. It rotated approximately 180 degrees. It came back down inverted on its roof. Means's car, which had been right behind it, went underneath the airborne 70 and into the same section of guardrail, by which point the guardrail itself had been bent inward by the McDuffie impact. Jimmy Means climbed out of his car. He walked over to the inverted 70. He looked inside. He immediately began waving his arms frantically for the safety crew. He told Ned Jarrett on ESPN, live, on the air, a minute later that it was so bad he closed his eyes. Means left the racetrack before the race was resumed. He simply could not stay. The track workers ran out with white sheets and held them up around the car to shield JD from the spectators. JD McDuffie was dead in the cockpit. He had died on impact. On pit road, Ed Peters, one of the crewmen, leaned against the pit wall and said quietly that he guessed JD went out in style. That was the first thing anyone from the team said out loud. NASCAR red flagged the race for 1 hour and 48 minutes to extract the body, clear the wreckage, and repair the barrier. During that red flag, with cars circulating slowly on the racetrack, NASCAR Public Relations Director Chip Williams handed a statement to Jerry Punch on ESPN and to Bill Bauer at MRN. He said, "I regret to inform you that JD McDuffie has passed away. He was 53 years old. Williams had the age wrong by 1 year. JD was 52. He would not have turned 53 until December." Bob Jenkins eulogized him on the air. And then Benny Parsons, whose own wife Connie had died earlier in 1991 at Pocono, came on the broadcast and spoke directly to Imogene McDuffie watching at home in Sanford. He said, "Jean, I know exactly what you're going through, sweetheart. There's not a one of these drivers that wants to be in that race car right now. I don't want to be here now. It is one of the most extraordinary live moments in the entire history of NASCAR television." And Benny Parsons absolutely meant every word of it. When the race resumed, Ernie Irvan won it in the number 4 Morgan McClure Chevrolet. Coming through victory lane, he was asked about JD. He said, "Every time we went through the turn where he crashed, I thought about him." He said, "I've known what it's like to struggle in this sport without a sponsor, just like he did, and I'll always remember him." JD McDuffie was credited with a 40th place finish. $2,595 in race money. Now we have to talk about what happened next, because what happened next is the institutional part of this story, and it is the part that should make every single person who calls themselves a NASCAR fan sit straight up in their chair. NASCAR did not conduct a serious investigation of the crash. The race went on. The body was sent to Schuyler Hospital in Montour Falls, New York, where on August 12, a doctor named Allenden performed the autopsy. He told reporters that JD had died of severe head injuries involving a fracture of the skull and severe brain damage. NASCAR's public interpretation of that finding emphasized rapid head movement to the right at the moment of impact, which is the textbook clinical description of what would later be widely identified as a basilar skull fracture. The same injury mechanism that would kill Adam Petty in May of 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Kenny Irwin Jr. in July of 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Tony Roper in October of 2000. The same mechanism that would kill Dale Earnhardt himself in February of 2001. JD McDuffie was the first NASCAR Cup driver of the modern era to die from that specific injury pattern, and his case received almost no formal institutional investigation. Here's what most people don't realize about this timeline. What did get investigated, and this is the detail that almost nobody in the mainstream NASCAR conversation ever discusses, was an independent inquiry commissioned and paid for by Medford Speed, the New Jersey shop that had built his engine. They hired two accident investigators named Phil Moser and Terry Shaw to examine the wreckage and determine what had actually killed him. And Moser and Shaw concluded something meaningfully different from NASCAR's position. They concluded that at the moment of impact, when the car hit that Armco-backed tire barrier passenger side first, a tire from the barrier itself had been driven up through the passenger side window opening and into the cockpit. They cited as evidence a black tar-like substance found smeared on the window glass. They cited damage to the foam padding of his helmet on the right side. They cited damage to the microphone tab on his helmet. The picture they constructed was that one of those barrier tires had come through the passenger window and struck JD on the right jaw. JD's daughter, Linda McDuffie, spoke to the journalist Ed Hinton about this years later, and she said her daddy's jawbone had been driven up through his skull. Ima Jean told Hinton that JD had bled to death upside down in the car, and that the car was full of blood. Those are the words of the family. So now you have two competing explanations for the precise cause of death. NASCAR says it was a rapid head movement injury, a basilar skull fracture from the crash dynamic. The privately commissioned Moser and Shaw report says it was an intrusion injury from a barrier tire coming through the window. The two findings are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Both could be partially true. The basilar skull mechanism could have been the primary cause of death, and the tire intrusion a secondary factor, or the tire intrusion could have been the primary cause and the autopsy described the resulting injury pattern. We cannot definitively resolve that question today. And the reason we cannot resolve it is that the wheel itself, the failed spindle, the actual mechanical evidence that initiated the entire crash sequence, was never returned to the family. It vanished from NASCAR custody. Brock Beard, who wrote the only serious book-length biography of McDuffie in 2018, titled JD, The Life and Death of a Forgotten NASCAR Legend, documents this directly. NASCAR declined to conduct a formal investigation. The car left the racetrack before the conclusion of the race. The wheel disappeared. We do not know to this day what specifically failed. Whether it was the spindle itself, the hub, the stud pattern, a brake rotor attachment. We cannot know. The evidence is gone. 4 days after the crash, on August 15, 1991, they buried him at Grace Chapel Christian Church in Sanford. About 2,800 people came through Bridges Cameron Funeral Home during the visitation period. Over 800 people packed the chapel for the service. The hearse was led to the cemetery by a van bearing the Rumpel Furniture logo with the words Car Number 70, JD McDuffie, Elon, North Carolina lettered across the spare tire cover. Only 2 drivers were visibly present in the sanctuary. Richard Petty on a crutch, and Jimmy Means, 3 rows back on the right side. The pallbearers wore McDuffie Racing pit crew uniforms with rumple furniture on the back and McDuffie Racing stitched down the trouser leg. The Reverend Robert Yandell preached. He told the congregation that only 5 drivers in all of NASCAR history had started more races than JD had accumulated. The Reverend Lee Dittman read the lyrics to The Impossible Dream and My Way. The Canadian crewman George Sekanina stood up unprompted during the service and delivered an unplanned eulogy. He said, simply, "He taught me a lot." They buried JD at Buffalo Cemetery in Sanford. Richard Petty, after the service, told reporters that after all the stuff JD had been through, he had to love what he was doing. He said there are very few people who can go away from this earth and say that. He said JD was enjoying his last few minutes. The following weekend at Michigan, in the Champion Spark Plug 400, several drivers ran black stripes on their cars in his memory. Darrell Waltrip delivered the pre-race invocation and a tribute that brought tears to the eyes of drivers who had spent their entire professional lives pretending nothing rattled them. And then they basically moved on. Imogene did not move on. In June of 1992, 10 months after her husband died, she filed suit in U.S. District Court for the Western District of New York against NASCAR and against Watkins Glen International. She asked for $4.25 million, $3.25 million in compensatory damages and $1 million in punitive damages. The case landed in front of a judge named Michael A. Teleska. In September of 1993, Judge Teleska granted summary dismissal. He ruled that JD McDuffie had been well aware of the dangers associated with auto racing. He wrote that it was inconceivable that a driver with McDuffie's extensive experience at the Glen would be unaware of the reasonably foreseeable risks attendant to Turn 5. He wrote that McDuffie had voluntarily assumed the risk of approaching Turn 5 at the fastest speed the car would carry. He pointed out that McDuffie had signed numerous releases over the years waiving his right to sue. Case dismissed. John Saunders, the track president at Watkins Glen International, called the decision a complete vindication. Imogene told the Associated Press she would not settle for that. She said, "They are guilty. They don't even have that track fixed right now." For the record, Watkins Glen International had announced the construction of the bus stop chicane, the inner loop reconfiguration of Turn 5, on October 8, 1991. Less than 2 months after JD died. Track officials stated publicly at the time of the announcement that the change had nothing to do with the accidents at the Glen. It was, they said, a long-term project. Nothing to do with it. The chicane was operational for the 1992 race. Driver speeds entering the old Turn 5 complex were cut by a significant margin. The barrier was reworked. Whatever the official position was, the racetrack quietly fixed the problem that had contributed to killing JD McDuffie on its own dime, on its own timeline, and without ever publicly acknowledging the connection. The team in Sanford did not survive him. There was a strange and ugly footnote in December of 1991, when a man named Jeffrey Tobias Bennett, a 31-year-old from North Carolina, contacted the Schuyler County Coroner's Office claiming to be JD's brother. The coroner's office had been holding JD's race day clothing. His uniform, his prescription goggles, his shoes, his personal effects. Bennett got the coroner to mail him the entire bundle. And then on December 20th, he sold the uniform to a Gastonia hobby shop owner named Earl Hill for $150. The grift was eventually discovered. The uniform changed hands a few more times. But the basic outline is that within months of one of the most beloved independents in NASCAR history being killed in a race car, somebody scammed his blood-stained driving suit out of a county morgue and sold it for $150. That is how lightly the system treated his memory. In 1995, the remaining assets of McDuffie Racing went up for auction. The 2 surviving Pontiacs, the blue car and the red car, were bought by a collector named Richard Pugh for $6,900. All blue, the 1970 Chevrolet Ramp truck hauler, was sold for $7,750, reportedly to Ken Schrader. All blue is currently displayed by Bailey Excavating in Michigan, one of JD's longtime sponsors. Marty Burke worked out an arrangement with the diecast manufacturer Racing Champions to license JD's number 70 likeness for collectible cars and directed the profits back to Imogene to help her raise a grandson. And then 10 years went by, and the cost of how lightly NASCAR had treated the JD McDuffie investigation came due. In 1994 at Daytona, during speed weeks, a journeyman driver named Rodney was killed in a practice crash that broke his neck. Then 4 days later, Neil Bonnet, who was attempting a comeback, was killed in another practice crash at Daytona. Same fundamental injury pattern. In May of 2000 at Loudon, New Hampshire, Adam Petty, Richard Petty's grandson and Kyle Petty's son, was killed in a Busch Series practice crash. Basilar skull fracture. 8 weeks later, at the same racetrack in New Hampshire, Kenny Irwin Jr. was killed in a Cup practice crash. Same fundamental mechanism. Same injury. Basilar skull fracture. The following month at the July race at Daytona, a man named Brett Bodine showed up in the garage with something on his head and neck that nobody in Cup had seen before. It was made of carbon fiber. It tethered his helmet to his shoulders. It had been designed by a Michigan State University engineering professor named Dr. Robert Hubbard and his brother-in-law, a sports car driver named Jim Downing. They had founded a company called Hubbard Downing Incorporated in 1990 to manufacture and sell the device. It had been on the market since 1991. Yes, 1991. The same year JD McDuffie died. Hubbard and Downing had been selling the Hans device for $3,000 to $5,000 apiece since the year JD was killed. Brett Bodine wore one. Kyle Petty wore one. They were among the first Cup drivers in the history of the series to do so. Almost 9 years after JD. In October of 2000 at Texas Motor Speedway, in the Truck Series, a driver named Tony Roper was killed in a crash. Basilar skull fracture. On February 18, 2001, on the last lap of the Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt, the same Dale Earnhardt who had walked through the garage at Daytona 10 years earlier with a hat in his hand, collecting $6,600 in cash to keep JD McDuffie on the racetrack, hit the Turn 4 wall at approximately 157 miles per hour. Basilar skull fracture. Pronounced dead at Halifax Medical Center. He was not wearing a head and neck restraint device. In October of 2001, NASCAR mandated the Hans device or an equivalent head and neck restraint for all Cup competition. 10 years and 1 month after JD McDuffie died in the corner at Watkins Glen. There were 5 Cup or top-tier fatalities between McDuffie and the mandate. The McDuffie case had established the injury pattern and the institutional response had established the template for inaction. Now, I want to be careful here, because the historical record does not permit us to say with certainty that if NASCAR had taken JD McDuffie's death seriously in August 1991, the Hans device would have been mandated in 1992 and Earnhardt and the others would have lived. Hubbard and Downing's device was unproven in stock car applications at the time. The sample size of basilar skull fractures was small in 1991. The political and economic friction inside the sport against mandating a $3,000 piece of equipment that drivers complained was uncomfortable would have been significant regardless of the impetus. What we can say, and this part is not in dispute, is that the information was available. The device was on the market. The injury mechanism was identifiable from JD's autopsy findings. The pattern was about to repeat itself 5 more times across the following decade. And the institutional response in August of 1991 was to lose the failed wheel, dismiss the family's lawsuit, fix the racetrack without acknowledging the connection, and move on to the next race weekend. That happened. Every piece of it happened. Here's the thing about Judge Teleska's ruling in Imogene's lawsuit. It captured the dominant institutional attitude of the moment with uncomfortable clarity. JD McDuffie had voluntarily assumed the risk. He had signed the releases. He knew what he was doing. He was an old man in an old car, and he died the way old men in old cars die. Case dismissed. But that framing completely misrepresents the actual story. Because the truth of the matter is that JD McDuffie was the last representative of a class of competitor that the sport could no longer functionally accommodate. He had been told for 15 years that the era he represented was over. He had been priced out, outclassed, and pushed back further on every starting grid for a decade. He kept showing up because he did not know how to do anything else. Because if he didn't race, he didn't eat. Because Rumpel Furniture and Sons Auto Supply and Bailey Excavating still believed in him, and he was not going to let them down. And because the man had written the words "never quit" on his life the way other people sign their name to things. He was out there in an 8-year-old chassis with a rebuilt transmission from a defunct team and a pop rivet in the brake line of his hauler because the sport had been telling him to leave for a decade, and he simply would not go. The economics had long since reached the point where a man operating at his resource level had no practical business in a Winston Cup race car, and the sport's response to that condition was to keep selling him entry forms and cash his check at the gate every single time he showed up. The structural failure that killed JD McDuffie was not confined to the spindle. The structural failure was a sport that had two completely different classes of competitor operating on the same racetrack simultaneously and was not willing to publicly acknowledge that fact or address its consequences. JD McDuffie's deteriorating equipment was the entirely predictable outcome of an industry that had been pricing out his entire generation for the better part of a decade. When he died, the institutional response was to lose the evidence, dismiss the lawsuit, quietly fix the racetrack while denying the racetrack had needed fixing, and move forward with the broadcast schedule. When his death pattern repeated itself 5 more times over the following decade, the institutional response was finally a Hans mandate in October of 2001. That 10-year gap between the warning and the action is the institutional legacy of August 11, 1991, and it sits alongside the man himself as part of the permanent record. In 2016 at Darlington's Throwback Weekend, Front Row Motorsports and a driver named Landon Cassill ran a tribute paint scheme in the old number 70 McDuffie racing colors. Don Ruppel, whose father had funded the team for most of a decade, was at the racetrack that weekend. The Bailey family was there too. It was the first time the 70 McDuffie car had appeared on a Cup grid since August 11, 1991. In 2021, the city of Sanford, North Carolina, commissioned an artist named Chris Dalton to paint a memorial mural on a wall in Carthage Square. The mural shows JD McDuffie smiling. It carries his motto in 2 words: never quit. His daughter Linda was there for the dedication. She was the last of the immediate family present that day. Ima Jean McDuffie lived on for 30 more years after her husband died on that racetrack in upstate New York. She passed away on August 8, 2021, the exact same week as the 30th anniversary of his death. She was 83 years old. Their son Jeff, who had been the crew chief on the day his father died and who had taken the call while standing on pit road, passed away in October of 2024. He was 62 years old. So back to the wheel. The thing that started this entire story. The piece of evidence that should have been preserved, investigated, documented, photographed, and made part of a permanent record that the sport and its safety officials could actually learn from. Where it ended up, nobody at NASCAR has ever publicly said. The most credible speculation comes from people inside the McDuffie team itself, who believed the wheel was either scrapped at the racetrack or taken home by someone involved in the post-crash procedures and simply lost in the years that followed. Marty Burke, who was at the racetrack that day and who knew that car as well as anyone alive, has gone on the record saying that nobody truly supported JD. And what he meant by that was not just the day-to-day reality of running a privateer team on used parts and borrowed money. He meant the way the sport treated the man's death afterward. Because in August of 1991, If you were the corporate sport with a billion-dollar future assembling itself in front of you, the very last thing you wanted on the public record was a serious formal inquiry into why a wheel had departed a stock car at 160 miles per hour at one of your showcase events. You wanted to run the race the next weekend. You wanted the cameras on Earnhardt and Petty and Waltrip. You wanted the sponsors and the networks and the new audience that was coming in from outside the South. And so the wheel went away, and a pattern that was about to kill 5 more drivers went unaddressed for a decade. The thing about JD McDuffie that none of the institutional arguments fully capture, and the reason that mural in Carthage Square says what it says, is that the man himself never framed his situation as a tragedy while he was living it. He didn't experience his career as a cautionary tale. He experienced it as the only life he had ever wanted, pursued on the only terms available to a man with his resources and his stubbornness and his absolute refusal to accept that it was over. He chewed his Tampa Nugget cigars. He wore his tennis shoes. He paid the breakfast tab at Watkins Glen with prize money from a charity race at Shangri-La and told the team they had a real good time. He walked into the drivers' meeting on the last morning of his life and laughed at Ernie Irvan's joke. He was not a tragic figure to the people who knew him. He was a man who had found the thing he was made for and had pursued it without interruption or apology for 30 years. The tragedy is not JD McDuffie's life. The tragedy is what the institution did and failed to do in the weeks and years after his death. Those are 2 separate stories that happen to share the same starting point, which is a left front wheel departing a number 70 Pontiac at 160 miles per hour on the 5th lap of a race at Watkins Glen International on the 11th of August, 1991. JD McDuffie was 52 years old. He had been racing for 28 years. He had started 653 Winston Cup races, which at the time of his death placed him 6th on the all-time list. He had won 1 pole at Dover in 1978 on McCreary tires while everybody else was on Goodyear. He had never won a race. He had never finished higher than 3rd. He had earned $1,338,000 over a career that spanned the entire modern era of stock car racing. He had buried himself in a sport that had outgrown him, and he had kept showing up anyway, because the sport was the only thing he knew how to do and the only identity he had ever wanted to carry. The wheel that killed him is somewhere out there, if it still exists at all. NASCAR has never accounted for it. The family never got it back. The questions it could have answered about why he died and how to prevent that specific death from happening again went unanswered for 10 more years and 4 more drivers and one of the most iconic figures the sport has ever produced. He was the last of them. There has not been another driver like JD McDuffie in Winston Cup or any of its successor series since the day his number 70 Pontiac came off that racetrack and never came back. There never will be. The economics of the sport made certain of that long before he died. He was the end of a line for a kind of racing and a kind of racer that this country produced for about 40 years and then stopped producing entirely. There are no more independents. There are no more men living out of a ramp truck and a shop behind their house, racing on parts that other teams have thrown away, surviving on sponsorship money from furniture stores and excavating companies and auto parts suppliers in towns that nobody outside the county has ever heard of. The corporate sport won. He lost. But he kept showing up right up to the morning of August 11, 1991, with a pop rivet in the brake line and cash in his pocket from a charity race the night before and a Rumple furniture cap on his head. And whatever else you want to say about JD McDuffie, whatever institutional argument you want to make about what the sport owed him and failed to deliver, that fact is the unambiguous truth of his life. He kept showing up. Never quit.